But thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Best-selling author Eloisa James will discuss her new historical romance, Hardly a Gentleman, in conversation with best-selling author Sarah MacLean in this installment of Author Hour in Massachusetts. So Eloisa is a USA Today and New York Times best-selling author of more than 30 historical romances that have been translated into 28 languages and has sold over 7 million copies worldwide. After graduating from Harvard University, she got a master's in philosophy from Oxford University, a Ph.D. from Yale, and eventually became a Shakespeare professor. By day, she now chairs the English department at Fordham University as Mary Bly. She lives with her family in New York City and in Florence, Italy. She's the mother of two, and in a particularly delicious irony for a romance writer, is married to a genuine Italian knight. And her new book, Hardly a Gentleman, so Eloisa returns to the Accidental Bride series with a romance about a forced marriage between a feisty heroine and a Scottish laird, neither of whom have plans to marry, let alone fall in love. And our conversation partner, our facilitator tonight, is Sarah MacLean, who's the author of best-selling novels that have been translated into more than 25 languages. She's the co-host of the weekly romance novel podcast, Fated Mates. She is a leading voice in the romance genre. Her latest novel, These Summer Storms, will be released this July. A product of Rhode Island summers and New England storms, Sarah now lives in New York City. So, for everyone watching live and all those watching the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Sarah and Eloisa for joining us here tonight. And Sarah, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Robert. What a great introduction. And thanks, Eloisa, old friend.
Thank you,
It's so nice to see your face. It's the middle of the night in where you are.
It's 1 a.m. in Florence. Not exactly the middle of the night, so
I mean,
fine. But it is black outside, as you can see behind me.
well, thank you for doing this late in the day for all of us. I'm so excited to talk about this book. As you know, I'm one of your biggest, longest standing fans. So I'm always happy to
Thank you,
talk
hon.
about your books. But I think for anybody who's joining us who maybe hasn't read this book yet or hasn't gotten to it yet, let's talk about it. Let's talk about where the book, how it came to be in your head. Tell everybody a little about it.
Well, so I had the idea. The idea is the first idea is on the cover because I had an idea about someone walking around a castle and coming across a laird in the street. Now you'll notice that HarperCollins, my lovely publishers, decided he could not be naked in the stream. You see, he's wearing pants, but he's still in the water, which is a little like they were like, well, it has to be shelved, etc. But my idea was that my heroine would walk around the castle and see a man naked in the stream fly fishing, because of course you wouldn't want to have your kilt, the pleats come out of your kilt, so you'd put it over a bush.
Sure.
Obviously.
This
But
is logical.
totally logical, totally logical. And of course, it is one of the jokes of the book that it's an icy look. And so she's like, hey, that's not too bad when he turns around to face her. And then later when there is marriage, yeah, as Emily is saying in the chat, shrinkage. Shrinkage when you actually marry and you're like, what is that? But it was also because this book opens up with a major humiliation of my heroine, Clara.
Mhm.
It was sort of a two-sided thing, because what happens is the regent, who is a really terrible guy historically, humiliates her at a garden party, and part of it, he rips her bodice, and her whole breasts are seen by everyone there, who stares at her, and it's humiliating, and her mother exiles her to Scotland the next minute, and one thing leads to another, and before you know it, she's pretending to be a housekeeper, as you do, and gets in a strange carriage, as you do, and boom, there she is at the castle. But I wanted to parallel those two moments. So So she is seen and he is seen because
Mhm.
she doesn't stop looking instantly. And so it's part of sort of the healing process to realize that it's natural that that if this is presented to you, it's not humiliation of the person. Something happens.
And this is something that you have done so well for so long. Like I feel like it's just something that you do better than so many of us, this kind of humiliated heroine and how she comes to turn her back on all the rules and start fresh. And I wonder, can you talk a little bit about why that heroine is so compelling for you and for all of us?
That would be high school. Just lay it out there. High school in a small farm town in Minnesota when, my dad was a poet, so we had no money, so no clothes that matched anyone else's. And, I didn't fit in about 4,000 different ways to one.
Hmm.
So I have plenty of that behind me. But I think that romance, in a lot of ways, is summed up as being about love or about whatever you want to sum it up as. But I often think it's about comeuppance. Um, so comeuppance is when, what seems wrong in the world turns right. So we can talk about romance in so many different ways, right for right now, or however you want to say it. But I really think that in some ways it's about there being some sort of um, organization in life or things will
Mm.
work out, right? So if I have a humiliated heroine, it's partly because that's a pattern that I've seen in my life, frankly. Um, High school was horrible for me, but guess what? Here I am in Florence, right? And I'm married, and I, I think I have a great husband, and my children are healthy. I mean, what more do you want?
Yeah.
Comeuppance has happened without it having to hurt anyone else, but I do think that things can turn around, and love can be part of that.
That's
So.
so interesting. I've never thought of it that way, that it's really about comeuppance, but you're absolutely right. Because I also feel like your books, there's something, I mean, all of historical feels like, historical's the subgenre that like really, really traffics in like these big, bold, huge feelings, right? And it feels to me like all of your books do have this moment where the heroine realizes that is she can love herself as much as anybody else can love her. And I love all those moments for all of your heroines. And it feels like such a real, like Eloisa James moment when you get there.
uh,
Um, so can we go back a little bit? Because I also noticed, because obviously you have a long-standing career, but I know you started reading romance before you started writing it. So I'm always interested in kind of origin stories. So will you talk a little bit about how you came to romance as a reader?
I actually think it's something genetic. I don't know about the rest of you, but everyone else was reading Charlotte's Web and crying over Charlotte dying at the end, and I was really interested in the fact that Fern went on the Ferris wheel with a boy. You know, so even back in my earliest memories, romance was what interested me. I mean,
Hmm.
plain, that was what interested me. And because I grew up in a household of literary writers, that was not what interested them.
Hmm.
So there was just a clash in which I was aware that my interests weren't uh, the most ethically pleasing to my parents. But you know
Mm.
what? In some ways, when we grow up, um, we become who we were in a sense meant to be. So I joke sometimes because my father won the American Book Award for poetry. I think, well, I was like Simon and Garfunkel grew up in the Bach family, right? At some point, you either accept that or you don't. And
Hmm.
I just leaned into it, much to my parents' dismay. I will say much more so my mother than my father. But yeah, so my earliest memories are getting my hands on romances somehow. Harlequin Presents were favorites. My grandmother had a few Barbara Cartlands, the Carnegie Public Library, which I always give a shout out to libraries because I wouldn't be here without them. Um, Georgette Hare, all of them, but then tons of other romances that I managed to find. They didn't have, Harlequin Presents back then, but they
Hmm.
had hardcover books that were sort of romantic.
And do you remember the moment where you thought, because obviously you're sort of renowned as being, you're an academic, you're a professor, you're a Shakespeare scholar. Do you remember the first time that you thought to yourself, like, I'm gonna, I'm gonna write a romance novel. I can do this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I graduated from college and I was like, I'm going to write a romance novel. That's
Hmm.
it. I'm going to do it. And I did it.
Was
It's
there a
called,
particular author, sorry, was there a particular author or like something that really sort of pushed you in that direction?
no, but I had learned so much from romance, like I read, I mean, everyone in choir class read Flame of the Flower, right? With the pages turned down. It went around and around. The pages turned down for what you were, so I mean, those books back then, the so-called bodice rippers, because they were bodice rippers. I mean,
Yeah.
bodices were ripped regularly. They were all, and like you're saying, they were huge emotion and everything was happening. And
Oh,
he was
absolutely.
total bastard. But in the end, he'd be like on his knees in front of her. And, my life just felt very, very small. So
Yeah.
I just wanted that. So I graduated and my boyfriend at that point got a job at a bank. And so that meant he had enough money to kind of sustain us. And I went and lived with him. And I was like, okay, I'm going to write a book. I was also cold calling, trying to make money selling cold water coolers, which I don't recommend to anyone. It's the most depressing thing ever. Horrible, horrible, horrible
Just soul
job.
crushing.
It was awful. It was terrible. I got $50 for every cooler rental I got. It was just, but anyway, um, I wrote this book. It's called Passion Slave. I still have it. It's about 550 pages long.
Wait, what? I had no
You
idea.
ever heard of it?
Listen,
No,
I'm
I know.
learning too. Wait,
This is
tell
great.
us more.
Well, so my heroine, because I had never had a creative writing class or anything like it, right? So it was just based on my love of the genre. It was enormous for one thing, but everything happened to her. She fell off a boat in the Seine. Then she got to some unnamed, desert a country. I didn't bother to figure out like what the name was. Who cared
No,
about
neither did
that?
anyone else
Right?
back then. So
She met a sheikh. Then she met another sheikh because one sheikh was, if you remember back in the 80s, like one sheikh's one, but two is better. I will say she had some extremely interesting adventures in the harem. She
Bertrice Small style.
yeah, yeah, yeah. She ran away and she got this was my truly original that I don't think anyone else had. She was spit in the eye by a camel, which caused her to be temporarily blind. And one of the sheikhs cared for her, lovingly cared for her. This taken hugely influenced by Crocodile in the Sandbank, for those of you who've read it. Anyway, and then later on, he was proved to be an English duke. And what do you know? She came back and she was a duchess.
Of
So,
course he was. Of course he was. You knew
so
all
here
the rules all right intuitively.
yeah. So I had the whole thing typed, and my boyfriend had a secretary at the time. And I was like, okay, that was really fun, but now I have to do something with my life because if I keep cold calling, I'm gonna, actually jump in front of a train. So I got a degree and went off to Oxford. And my boyfriend got his secretary to send it out. And she sent it out to everyone in Publishers Weekly. Back then, there was in a book, right? So my favorite rejection letter, which I might let you see someday, Sarah, is from the Sierra Club. They said it was very frisky. They enjoyed it in the mailroom, but it was not in their line.
It's not appropriate for the Sierra Club.
So meanwhile, they're sending this thing back, right? They're sending 550, 600 pages back, which they would never do now. But of course, now everything's
No, I mean
electronic.
this is the way it was. It was so
Wow.
different.
Yeah. So my mother was an early environmentalist. So she was taking these huge packages of paper and piling them up next to her desk and then ripping them open when she needed more paper.
Oh my
I was
God.
away at Oxford studying drama to 1640, which is basically Shakespeare. And she called me up and she was like, honey, I'm so sorry. I stopped opening them. And I just opened the letter from Harlequin and they like your book. Yeah. they were like, you'd have to cut one shake. You can't have the camel spit. You know, they had
You can't have the camel spit in
the
her eye.
harem was out, was going to be out. It had to be like, I don't know, 150 pages. But I didn't even answer because she didn't open it up for like 8 months afterwards. And I was by then being deeply competitive into my Oxford degree and had made lots of friends there. So I
Mhm.
was like, well, that's good to know. But I didn't go back to romance then for
You were
years.
like, Plan B.
Plan B is under, I'm going to be an academic. I'm going to be a professor. It's going to be great. Because I always had these two sides, right? I had my
Yeah.
parents, and then I had the books I loved. And
Mhm.
so I became a professor, and I became a junior professor with a lot of debt because you know what? You don't go to Oxford and all these places when your parents have no money and without taking on debt. And my husband was like, oh, you can't have a second baby. So I had to write something.
Hmm. And so there it was. But sheiks were out the window, and here you were in Regency, England.
Right. So then what I did was I bought,
Probably best, honestly, to make that pivot.
and then, yeah, considering I know nothing about shakes at all, that was probably a good idea. Uh,
Hmm.
I bought 5 books by Catherine Coulter and 5 books by Judith McNaught, who was my favorite.
Oh, she's the best. She's the best.
But Catherine Coulter was number one at
I
that point
mean,
and very good, excellent, um, like planning. Like she could plan a plot like nobody else. Judith McNaught
hmm.
was all huge emotion, and you're sort of like, really? Then you think, don't think about really. Don't question yourself too much. It's like watching a Shakespeare play. You have to suspend your disbelief. Catholic culture at that point was much more like dun 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 dun. Dun. So
Hmm.
I just dissected those books and wrote a book on them and sold for a few $1,000s over my student loans. But
So
free
somebody
book.
asked me a question not long ago, and I'm going to ask you because it's the best question I think I've ever heard somebody ask me, which is, when you think back at the first book, right, which was Potent Pleasures,
Well, no, it was Passion
um,
Slave.
oh, well, okay, let's skip over Passion Slave
Sure,
for the
fine,
purposes of this
fine,
question. Let's
fine.
talk about a book people can read, and actually has just been rejacketed and is coming out in a new format. So everybody head out if you haven't read that one because it's so beautiful. And it has probably one of the first lines of a romance that I mean, I just love the first line of that book. But when you think about that book, that sort of first book, and now you think about your book now, the first book now, do you feel like there is something, what can you see as the through line between the first and the now? However many, but what is it? 25 books in?
35, yeah.
35, see?
I've been doing it a long time. Well, interestingly enough, I would say that the through lines actually go right back to Penelope Blaze, which was my initial pseudonym back then, right? A clue to my blazing pages. She was,
Mm,
um,
Penelope
but yeah,
Blaze.
certain things just go right back. I mean, the highly protective alpha,
Yep.
right? He's nursing you through the camel spit, or just going to Potent Pleasures, which, as you say, everyone can read. Um, you know, he, a highly protective and yet wounded alpha. I think I do well. I think I do a woman who is fights back really well.
Hmm.
The
Yeah, a heroine who stands up for herself.
stands up for herself, and and yet my books have changed. I mean, if you write that long, so I've been writing for most of my life, right?
Hmm.
Um, if you're writing that long, it's really interesting to think too how they have changed. And
Hmm.
if you go and read Potent Pleasures and Midnight Pleasures, which also is about to come out with a new cover, and please do. I meet people all the time who are like, "That's my favorite book," and I'm like,
It's a
my
beautiful
first
book.
book and downhill from there, but try not to think that. But I poured emotion onto those pages. I mean,
Yeah.
I wept hysterically writing it. And Midnight
Yeah.
Pleasures, I wept even harder. So I poured myself into the books. And you know as well as I do, Sarah, that the thing that makes a book sing, a romance, is how much is real inside, right? So
Yeah.
how much comes out of my high school experience, how much comes out of my marriage, how much comes out of my life. Um, and those books, I just poured my Judith McNaught inspired emotion into them, and
Yeah.
and um, and I put a lot of myself into them.
Well, because it felt like back in the day when you and I both started writing, or when you and I both started reading romance, there were so many historicals compared to everything else. And historicals really are the subgenre of like all the drama, right? Like you can write a wild plot in historical that you just can't
Yeah.
quite pull off in a contemporary. I mean, maybe Susan Elizabeth Phillips can pull it off, but the rest of us are bound by a different set of laws. Um, so I wonder, did you ever, I mean, now there's so much talk about historical, about, you know, whether or not historical has a place. And I think obviously with all the people who are listening today, it obviously does. But why historical? Was it just because that's what you were reading? Is it because there's something, I mean, it feels like historical just is natural for you.
Historical is natural for me because I teach Shakespeare. So
Mm,
day in, day out, I teach people walking and talking in the past. So, um, so it makes sense for me. But also it makes sense for me because honestly, my I'm not totally in, to write a contemporary now, um, the when you're writing over a long period of time, the relations between, and I write about men and women, so the relations between men and women have changed a lot. Consent
mm.
being one of the most obvious, but they've changed in many, many little ways, right? Lots of little ways. And I don't know how to put it exactly. I'd say that I love reading contemporary. I wouldn't want to write it. I wouldn't want to try to be correct within it.
Yeah.
Historical, you can be so wildly incorrect. And it's correct, period,
Sure,
And
there's
uh,
Vaseline on the lens, right?
yeah, whereas the problem with the contemporary, if you're, and I do love an asshole hero, I really do. This doesn't happen to be one of them, but if you read Potent Pleasures, um, I do like a guy who really needs to be brought to his knees. But if I read him in a contemporary, he would make me extremely uncomfortable. And
Yeah.
as it is, what I try to avoid is any situation where I think that people would need therapy. So I don't have any kind of spousal abuse. I don't have any childhood abuse. I don't have anything rape, nothing like that, because that to me would need therapy to get over. I
Yeah.
tried one drunk hero in Time Taming of the Duke, and that was challenging. Um,
I mean, you did that really magnificently. That's, I mean, as I've told you a million times, that is my favorite of all of your series, and it's a little bit because of the Little Women of it all, and a little bit because of that final book, which I think is so deftly done. Can we talk about retelling? Because I feel like that's also a thing that you have done kind of again and again, or I don't know if would you call it retelling? I guess it's the first question. And then I wonder if you could talk about just sort of how you think about, Jane Ann Krentz says genre carries the myth, right? And it feels like we have this really remarkable job in romance to like rethink myth and like cultural myth. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you think about writing through the lens of somebody who has such extensive knowledge of the classics. I mean, it's hard to read an Eloisa James novel without sort of seeing all the ways that you're really having a conversation historically and in contemporary fiction.
well, I'll just go for the simpler question, which is like when you're retelling a fairy story, right?
Mm,
Because in some ways, every romance is a retelling, right? So I've retold Romeo and Juliet as Once Upon a Castle, because that relationship was never going to make it without a lot of help, that kind of thing.
mhm, mhm,
People
mhm.
obviously live. But I think if you think of something like The Ugly Duchess, which is my retelling of The Ugly Duckling, the key thing with the retelling of a fairy story in particular, I think, is to rethink what the question is at the heart of it. So the question at the heart of The Ugly Duckling, there's so many questions, but the one that interested me when I was writing that is, what does it mean to be called ugly? Or what does it mean to be called beautiful? Right? I did what does it mean to be called beautiful in When Beauty Tamed the Beast? And then ugly with The Ugly Duchess. And what I did was base my Duchess, who was considered ugly, on a current supermodel because
Mm.
our ideas of how people should look have changed, right? So she was a supermodel, and then her husband, who was considered incredibly beautiful and had this unbelievable voice, ran away and become a pirate after 4 days of marriage because why not? Anyway,
Because romance reasons.
reasons, right? When he was out there, he got tattooed, as you do when you're a pirate.
Because romance tattoos.
And he came back and he'd had throat damage. So now he sounds, and actually he quotes Leonard Cohen, one of my favorite singers. And he's considered wildly ugly because he's tattooed his face. So the whole book in the book was about falling in love, and it was about this the horrible humiliation of the beginning. I got to say there is another one that leaps off of humiliation. Um, but it was also about what does it mean to be called ugly, to be considered so ugly that your husband runs away after 4 days of marriage, whereas in fact we would consider her a supermodel, or we would consider his voice now to be Leonard Cohen's. They considered it ruined, right?
Hmm.
Because it was scratchy and low.
Hmm.
So it was all about how damaging those labels are. And I really loved rewriting the fairy stories because of that ability to think about what they, uh,
Yeah.
what is really being said in When Beauty Tamed the Beast, right? Who's the beast and who's beauty? And what does it mean if people are always saying you're beautiful? And then in that book, what does it mean if your beauty is taken away?
Mhm.
I, yeah, I just really enjoyed writing those. So.
I just want to say to everybody listening, don't forget to drop your questions in the Q&A. I have a few more questions, but I want to make sure that we give everybody a chance. So you said something really fascinating, which is when you come at a book, when you come to an idea, you think of it as what is the question at the heart of the story. So when you think about Hardly a Gentleman, what is the question at the heart of the story?
Well, okay, so that wasn't a retelling of
No,
anything,
but
but a
I
story
still
to have
think
a question out. But yeah, in some sense, there, I was thinking about how we expose ourselves, right? Or how we are exposed. And then
Mhm.
when we are exposed, how do we deal with it? How do we deal with that moment of being seen by someone else?
Mhm.
So he's living in this castle. So I'll just give you a bit at the beginning. It won't wreck the story, but he's in this tumble down little castle that's come incredibly dirty, and he's a widow of 2 years, and everyone thinks he's living in this castle and it's so dirty because his heart is broken, right? Because he had this perfect love affair, perfect marriage, and she died. Um, and and no one really sees him,
Yeah.
and no one really sees her. She's been on the market, the marriage market for 4 years. She's considered a failure. She's a failure partly because the regent has been sexually harassing her for 4 years, but um, so this one, it was really about being seen. Who
Mhm.
sees you and what happens when someone actually sees you? So I know that like I got a complaint from a reader and she said, well, um, they didn't talk enough. I think actually they talked quite a lot. But the hardest things to say are the ones that you don't say right away, right?
Yeah, of
They're the
course.
hardest things to admit. The fables that are told about you that you don't want to let go of, or the things that feel like they'd be betraying someone by saying the truth. So in his case, if he tells this truth, he would be betraying his former wife. And you don't. You don't.
Yeah.
Just
Well,
let
that's so interesting because it feels like romance is one of those. There is, I mean, romance is always about truth, right? It's always about finding truth over the course of a relationship. But we lie so much as people at the beginning of a relationship.
we
And
do.
it really takes a long time before we feel comfortable telling the truth.
Right.
Um,
He knows instantly he's going to marry her, right? One of the
yeah,
first, it's a question
yeah.
of love on his part. He chooses first, or however you want to put it, but he
I mean,
knows,
he's sort of
he knows,
gone, he's
yeah.
like a mess from the jump.
But he's still not going to say, because saying everything about his past would mean betraying his wife,
Yeah.
dead wife.
Well, it's interesting because somebody in the chat talked about that how they love that sort of a twist on Rebecca, that sort of Rebecca-esque first wife.
Hmm.
and the grieving, like a twist on the kind of grieving mother-in-law. And
Yeah.
I think all of this is really, I think one of the things that I see in your books as your books have evolved is these kind of like these secondary and tertiary characters who really are so powerful to the story. So can you talk about how that came to be in the story?
Um, I mean the sort of well, the thing about a romance, I don't know, I'm not telling you, so I'm telling everyone to do this, is that if you just stick with the two people or throuple or whatever it is you're dealing with, it's going to be really boring.
Mm.
You just have the pretty boy meet the pretty girl at the high school reunion. Those are some seriously boring books, and they're all being written by AI and loaded up on, Amazon right now because I'm a
Just saying the quiet thing loud tonight, Eloisa.
I love Kindle Unlimited. I'm really dismayed by what's happened to
Yeah,
Kindle
yeah,
Unlimited.
yeah, yeah.
'Cause it used to be where the unusual voices were and where I could go. And,
Hmm.
I adore people like Mariana Zapata, who's still writing wonderful books, but it just feels a lot harder now because AI books tend to be extremely, well, narrow, tiny, tight. They're very tight. If you're looser, right, then you have a circle of friends. Like you're so brilliant at that, Sarah. A circle, a heroine with girlfriends, a heroine with women she could depend on,
Hmm.
um, a
And
hero with friends, a hero with a brother. It's
yeah.
that's what makes it a real book. That's what makes it a real novel for
And
me.
that's a real shift from the beginning of romance, right? We talk a lot on the podcast about how in the, 70s, 80s, like the heroines were really on an island, like they were alone.
Um,
And then they would be like, talk about sent to Scotland, right? Like Julie Garwood heroines were often just like plucked from their nunnery and like shipped
yeah,
off to Scotland to be
true.
married to a laird, and they had no one. They had a
Right.
wolf, like the wolf they befriended
Yeah,
from
they're
the wolf.
tied to a stake, and then the next minute they're
Yeah.
off
And
into the castle.
so, I mean, I think that is probably, if I had to say, like, what's the biggest shift in generationally in romance, it is these sort of casts of characters.
Yeah.
Community
Right.
becomes so vital to the books.
In my early books, I remember at some point I was switching publishers and I had to write a description of what was best about my books. And back then, I said it's sisterhood. Um, I think that's so important.
Yeah.
Over time, my books have changed a lot. Um, so that wasn't quite as evident in this one, although again, she has a wonder, she meets, she's joining a community. It's something you see in a Shakespeare play too, right? By the end, the couple, whoever they are in a Shakespeare romantic comedy, is re-brought into the community again. And that's a really important part. And I like that a lot.
Well, and I think also while this book, may not have the same exact sort of structure that we're talking about, I think the all of the characters who are referenced and who are pieces of this puzzle are so nuanced. Like there is a complexity to
Yeah,
them that I think when we were first starting, like that complexity wasn't, or when I was first starting and when you were starting, like the complexity wasn't there for these sort of more for these again like sort of
yeah,
exterior characters. And it was because we were taught that it was just, your love, right? Your relationship with this one person is
right.
the only thing of value. And now I think romance is doing a very different thing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, people came along like before me, like Lisa Kleypas, right?
Hmm.
I mean, she's just so brilliant at capturing. I learned a lot from reading her books
I
carefully.
mean, so say we all, right?
I'll say we all, but I will say, I mean, one of the things like I like writing kids. I have a kid in this book, and his tagline is, "Are you serious?" And I was walking down Broadway in New York, and I heard this little boy's voice, and he said, "Are you serious?" Oh, doesn't that kind of just bring together what we think when we're like 8 years old? Can this
Mhm.
be serious? Are you
Is
really
this for
seeing
real?
this? Are
Yeah.
you for real? Yeah. So sometimes you just grab something out of real life when you're walking down the street and can turn it into a character, and that's a lovely thing.
Hmm. I know people often like to hear about process, and I also know like some people don't love to talk about process, including me. But let's talk about your process because I get to ask the questions. So,
Of course.
talk about how, I mean, this, you've done this, you're an exceptional pro. How does a book come to be for you?
Well, I write a lot, but I revise a lot. I mean, for anyone who's out there who's writing, who wants to be a writer, who is a writer, working on writing, I find that the most important thing I can do is write and then rewrite. Like, say you write 20 pages and you cut 10.
Mm,
You write 10 and you rewrite those 10 entirely. You write a character and you realize that character doesn't belong.
has to
Those
come
are the
out.
hardest things, I think, really, and they don't get any easier, 30 some books in. It's not any easier to say, oh, this, I'm writing a contemporary right now, and I realized one whole character has got to go, and she's my favorite, but she's got so much more clever lines than the heroine. She's got to go.
Oh,
But
that's the worst when you write a secondary character who just steals the show.
heartbreaking. Well, I'm writing a version of King Lear, and King Lear has the Fool, right? So I wrote the Fool, but the Fool is this wonderful woman named Mira, and of course she got all the great lines because if you read King Lear, Shakespeare also gave the Fool all the great lines. So
Hmm.
anyway, I did that well, but now it's got to completely be disemboweled. But I think that my process is slow, and I will say that it's changed over time. I keep having to go back and learn. So I went through in the last 4 or 5 years, I went through a big Dickens kick, and I learned an enormous amount about ending chapters, ending paragraphs, ending conversations from Dickens. Right at the moment, I have been deep in Jane Austen, Northanger Abbey in particular. My next book coming out is kind of Gothic adjacent.
Hmm.
So Northanger Abbey is it's a love story like Jane Austen's, but she's also really making fun of the Gothic. And so I have this Gothic adjacent because I'm also making fun of the Gothic. And
Hmm.
I don't go into it wholeheartedly. I go in and make fun of it while having a little ghost action.
Have you, speaking of that, have you read Rebecca Romney's Jane Austen's Bookshelf?
Yeah, are you kidding? Yes,
It's
I love that book.
so terrific.
Yeah.
If for those of you who don't know, Rebecca Romney is a rare book collector and a rare book dealer and Austen aficionado, and she went out and she read the kind of 8 authors who Austen wrote about and said, this book is on a shelf, or she might reference a book in one of her books. And it's really remarkable. It's like a really fantastic look at how Austen came to think about her own writing through the lens of other women writers of the time. Because we think Austen sort of came out of nowhere and was the first of her kind.
No, but I will say the thing I think about is I was totally interested to read it, but I thought it was going to be very academic. It's not.
It's not at
It's just
all.
a wonderful, each chapter is just this wonderful, colloquially written,
Yeah.
sort of exploration of what these other crazy women writers were doing at the time of Austen, which is
Yeah.
just
And
remarkable.
a really beautiful memoir. Like there's, Rebecca tells the story, like her story collecting the first editions of all of these women and like her own life in the balance. It's so
It's,
fun. You should all
it's a
go read
great
it.
book. Yeah.
After you read Hardly a Gentleman, of course.
Well,
Um,
and then what about Sarah and I are both in an Austen anthology coming out this fall that everyone should read too.
yes,
Ladies
which I
in
keep
Waiting.
forgetting to talk about
So,
places, but it's called Ladies in Waiting. Tell us, what did you, and the directive was retell or reimagine a secondary character from an Austen novel who does not get a happily ever after
in the novel,
in the
although that's
novel.
been my story. So
Yes,
I
we
chose
our task was to happily ever after these characters. So who are you writing about?
I chose Sense and Sensibility. So the younger sister in Sense and Sensibility, which if you've seen the movie, you would remember her being up in a treehouse, always reading. In Austen's novel, she says that she is very silly, so she is not sensible. Um,
Hmm.
but she has way too much sensitivity. But I enjoyed it so much because it's the first thing I've written that was in first person. And so
Mm.
it has it, and she's quite young, although I made her older than the Jane Austen book. And so it was really fun because I got to see, from Sense and Sensibility, Marianne and so on married, and they have some kids, and you get to play around with the Austen characters whom you love. So that was fun. I really, really enjoyed it. How about you? Which one did you do?
I chose Emma. I chose Miss Bates,
Aha.
who I have always talk about being humiliated.
Yeah, I
I
know.
mean,
Worst,
she
right?
has broken my heart every time I've ever read it or watched it in every form. And I just felt like Miss Bates deserved a, thick-thighed, handsome man
Brawny, definitely
to
brawny.
come sweep her off her feet. A former, a former a sailor turned baron,
Yeah.
returned to show everyone, including Emma Woodhouse, that Miss Bates can get it.
Yeah. I love it. I
Miss
can't
Bates
wait.
can get it is basically what that book should be called, what that novella should be called. But it was what a fun project that
Yeah.
was.
Yeah. Lovely.
So there are a bunch of questions, so I want to ask them. Everybody, put your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. First one, and I'm interested in this too. Emily wants to know, not contemporary, but have you ever considered another historical era?
Well, I've written in the Regency period and in the Georgian period. So Regency is Jane Austen and Georgian is Marie Antoinette, big wigs. I enjoyed that a lot. I wrote Desperate Duchesses in that series and also The Wild Family. Um, so I considered at some point going into the Victorian era, but honestly, I know those areas, those two eras are so incredibly different and they're so much fun. So you have
Mhm.
the Georgians, who are much wilder, right? They really, a lot of people living apart from their husbands, raising their illegitimate children, etc. And the Regency period, which is much more tamped down. By the time you get to the Victorians, they're seriously tamped down. And I played around with it and decided that's not really for my characters. My
Yeah.
characters would not be good Victorians. They're naughty Victorians. So yeah, I stayed there. But as I said, I'm writing this rewriting of King Lear, because I did write one contemporary novel, Lizzie and Dante. And so I'm writing another one. So I guess
Mhm.
that's another period, if not historical.
So Claudia asks, she would love to have you give a few of your heroes and heroines high school yearbook superlatives. So let's do this. Best dressed. Oh, I know the answer to this one.
Oh God. Okay, you tell me the answer to that one.
Doesn't it feel like it's VBA?
Yeah, no, I can't do I cannot do the names of my heroines. There are like way too many of them. Okay, I would say it's the heroine whose name is blanking. I'm blanking out at the moment on Born to Be Wild.
Hmm.
What is her name? Leonora? Which one would you say, Sarah? Lavinia.
Heroine
Lavinia. Thank you, Lindsay. I was close.
Lavinia is a good one. It could, yeah, that's, it was very clear to me which hero, but I don't know. We'll go with Lavinia. Um, Most tragic. Oh boy.
Well, most tragic would be my heroine in Midnight Pleasures because
The question is at the beginning of the book, are we talking about most tragic? Or are we talking about like that one in When Beauty Tamed the Beast, where he crawls through a chicken coop of
oh,
glass, basically,
yeah,
and
to get
suffers his
her.
way?
That's one of my best scenes.
The
Hey.
greatest moment in romance. Just suffer.
Well, there you go. See, take it from your real self. I grew up on a farm. Clearing the chicken coop is something that is embedded in my memory. Um, yeah, well, I would say most tragic would be the heroine of Midnight Pleasures, just because some really tough things happened to her. But trust me, it ends out well. It's a very happy book in the end.
Okay, how about this one? There seems to be a penchant for at least one outdoor spicy scene. Why do you like to have them do it outside? What's been your favorite place to have them do it?
I did that for a long time, and then I decided it was becoming a cliche of my own, so I stopped. But
Core story.
that, not TMI, but if you grew up in Minnesota, you do end up making love outside. And my favorite is probably under a pine tree in the deep, deep snow, because the snow will scour under and leave this warm open space under a fir tree where the heavy fir boughs go down. And I put that in a book and I can't remember which one it is. So
That's pretty perfect. I
yeah.
mean, that's a great answer. My answer to that has always just been like, well, you can't just always have them do it in the same place, so you got to mix it up. But
But
under
people
a fir tree in the snow, that is some Minnesota stuff.
yeah, I have another one on the ice lake. I grew up in nature, let's just say that.
So let's see. What this one's a simple one. How is the hero's name in this book pronounced? And that is a good one because I just called him Kalen, but maybe that's
Yeah,
not right.
yeah, that's what I did too,
Yeah.
Clara and Palin.
Okay.
I think I actually did run it through one of those machines, they have online now for names, and I think it was Kalen. So,
Could you, oh, we talked, could you share your writing advice for new authors?
so new authors, yeah. Well, advice for writing is, really that old one, kill your babies, right? But another huge one, I just went to a reading given by one of my former students. And, because I teach at Fordham, but as well as teaching Shakespeare, I now teach Dungeons, Dragons, and Dukes every once in a while, which is genre fiction, which I'm very proud to say Adriana Herrera took. But just that show don't tell is just so crucial. If you find yourself reading a book aloud and you're just telling us everything, it's going to be boring. You have got to put it on the page. You might want to try writing an entire chapter in dialogue only, which, by the way, is how Nora Roberts writes the first draft of all her novels.
Is that really? I didn't know that about Nora.
Yep.
Well, I'm going to give everybody a piece of advice that you gave me
Oh,
when I was writing my second book and that I quote all the time. And I always quote you, cite my source. But that is that when I was writing the second book ever, my second romance, I remember meeting you in New York somewhere because we both live here. And you saying, and you said, how's it going? And I was like, well, I have this idea. My problem is like, I have this idea for the next book and I just can't like give it up. I'm like, I'm already thinking about the next book. And you said, never leave ideas on the table. Put them all in the book you're working on. And like trust that the next idea will come. And since then, I have tried really hard to do that and just like pile the ideas as they come into the book that I'm working on. And I think what that ends up doing is building a real strong like through line of a plot. Like often that's just like it's how you move the pages along.
yeah.
But I think a lot of authors, especially in the early days, think to themselves like, well, I can't do too much in this book, or like I can't put that in, I have to save it for the next one. But
No,
there will always be a new idea. So
you cannot have too many tropes either. Let me just say that.
Tessa
Like,
Bailey is an absolute success because she believes that. So let's see. Oh, here's a good one. Is there a trope you would avoid at all cost as a writer? Is there something you haven't? Well, wait, I have two questions then. Let's do that one. Is there one you've never written because you won't ever write it? And is there one that you haven't written but that you sort of really want to tackle?
well, so Emily is saying secret baby. I don't think I've ever had a secret baby. Um,
I don't think I don't think so either.
I'm thinking about, I mean, I just don't think I would have a secret baby um, because this is a reflection of where I live now. I mean, it was so important for my husband being around when those babies were born. I'd hate to take that away from someone. Like I
Mm.
have trouble with my very, very favorites. Um, Harlequin Presents, which I adore. When they come along, the billionaire comes along 5 years later and there's the 5-year-old kid, and I'm like, oh, ouch. So kind of, yeah. Deborah's pointing out I've sort of done it in the wilds. A little bit. I would say I don't think pirates are going to work in the same way they did now, because I wouldn't be really comfortable with somebody being kidnapped. these days. I wouldn't like that. So I think some things come and go, but really interestingly, some things survive in other places, like in space, for example. There's a lot of wild stuff going on in space, right?
Hmm.
So, there's things going on. There's places to find every trope. Let me say, a lot of the things I see in like dark mafia romances, for example, I would never write.
No, but it's so interesting because, Sophie Jordan says mafia romance is just medieval romance, like, but in a contemporary wrapper. And I think that's really like an interesting way of looking at it. Like, mafia seems to have the permission to do a lot of the
Yeah,
work that historical used to be doing. I
right.
agree.
So it's just not comfortable for me, but it's around in other places.
So there's a question about Austen, which is who is your favorite male main character in Austen? And what is your favorite of her books? And what is your favorite of the adaptations?
Oh well,
Yeah,
I'm
there's a
so
lot.
because in Pride and Prejudice, Darcy is the only one who has to apologize twice. And I love a groveling hero. I really do.
I
And I
know.
also really love a good humiliation scene. And that is a great humiliation scene. It's
Oh, terrific.
not good enough for me. That pretty much encapsulates like a lot of humiliation scenes in life and in literature. So I would go with that. I'd go with Darcy and Lizzie. And I think there's a reason why it's by far the favorite, right?
Of course.
I Yeah, and in terms of I actually like all of them, but I think Colin Firth can't be beat. So I'll go with Colin. Colin in his shirt.
I
Wait.
took my daughter to see because they just re-released the 2005 Pride and Prejudice in the movie theaters, and I took her to see it. And I mean, just an incredible experience watching an 11-year-old just like soak in the Matthew
Yeah,
McFadden, clearly Keira
yeah,
Knightley of it all.
yeah. That's a
What a
great,
joy.
yeah.
Is the contemporary King Lear retelling a Mary Bly novel? Kate's asking.
I don't know. You know, when I wrote Lizzie and Dante, I insisted on it being a Mary Bly novel, partly because it was a tearjerker, right?
Mm.
Lizzie and Dante is a real tearjerker. The King Lear is not a tearjerker. My version of Cordelia lives and meets a very, very sexy English solicitor. So,
Hmm.
yeah, so it'd probably come out as Eloisa. Yeah, but I've got a lot of work to do on it still. I want to hear. I mean, Sarah, for you guys who don't know, Sarah has this amazing contemporary coming out, which I think she should tell us all about right now because I can tell you, I read it. It kept me up half the night, which I was very irritated about. And if I could write my contemporary half as well as that, I would be ecstatic. So come on, tell us about Summer Storms.
So the book is These Summer Storms. Look, I have this one too. And it is out in July. It is a hopefully big summery
It is.
beach book. It'll take you to the beach and give you a lot of joy at the beach. The story, it's about um, a dysfunctional family of siblings, the children of a billionaire tech genius who, when their father dies in kind of a freak accident, they're all summoned home to a private island off the coast of Rhode Island in the week following his death, only to discover that he's left them an inheritance game. And in order for them to activate the inheritance, they have to complete a series of tasks. So it's a little bit inheritance game, a little bit like the Westing game, if you were, if you were a Westing game fan, a little bit Succession, a little bit Knives Out, and it's all the protagonist Alice is the estranged daughter of the family. And the game itself is presented by her father's lieutenant, who is a true MacLean hero, thick thighs, very stern, justifiably punches someone in the face. So while I feel like it's not a true romance novel because it's really about the family, there is a big romance through line and a happily ever after. So, I hope people will really love it. I had a great time writing it. It is a contemporary. Um, it was really fun. It was a fun change of pace. So,
They're gonna love it, Sarah. It's
Thank
like such
you.
a beach book. I mean, it is a beach book, but on the other hand, I mean, I just loved Al. I loved the heroine. I loved the fact she'd been estranged from her family and that she'd broken free of all the money. And, I think we are all a little dicey about millionaires, billionaires, these days, right? 10
Hmm.
billionaires. And I don't know. I just thought she was fantastic. I think
Oh,
everyone's gonna love it. And
thank
people
you
are
so
saying
much.
These Summer Storms is the name.
These Summer Storms, and again, that's out in July. Emily has a question. Do you work on more than one book at a time?
I do. Yeah.
Oh,
Well, right now I'm working on the second Gothic novel. So the first one is coming out next spring and it's called The Last Lady B. And right now I'm writing the second one, which is totally fun and I'm enjoying it so much. So I work on that. And I'm also working on the King Lear rewriting, which is called Fee and the Rock Star at the moment, because my King Lear is a retired rock star with $1 million to give away. So it's not an inheritance game or anything so fun. And I'm also writing a story for those of you who might have read my memoir, which is called Paris in Love. It was about the year that we sold our house and we sold our cars and we moved to Paris. We uprooted our kids and moved to Paris for a year. And I wrote Paris in Love. And so at the moment, we're living in Florence, which we always do. My husband's is from Florence. And I'm writing a Florence in Love book.
oh,
It
nice.
take a long time
That's
though.
so
Working on it for like
exciting.
4 years. Yeah.
There is a question for me about Duchess. I'm writing it now. It'll come out next year. So I promise it's coming. I'm not going to leave you hanging. Um,
Mhm.
it is about 8 o'clock. Eloisa, just tell everybody. So the next book is in spring.
The next book is called The Last Lady B, and it's up for pre-order. And I would be greatly honored if you would pre-order it. That would mean a lot because I switched publishers. So, as Sarah did with these Summer Storms, when we switch publishers, we have to, impress our new publisher because we're both leads
Exactly.
at our old publisher. And so now it's like, oh, um,
You have to
so
like put on makeup when you go to meetings. It's like a whole new world.
you have to. It's a whole new thing. I've been there for so long that yeah, makeup wasn't in the question anymore. But now I have to like put on the Ritz, which means trying to get my readers to pre-order The Last Lady B. But we also have that wonderful Ladies in Waiting, the Jane Austen
Hmm.
story. It's coming out
Yeah,
in the
and that
fall.
comes
Both
out in November because it is the 250th anniversary of Jane Austen's birth.
And it's a
Yeah.
really interesting book because it's got like a lot
Yeah.
of, I think we're the only romance writers. I mean, there's Adriana,
Diana Quincy too.
Laura
Oh,
Lippman. I mean, all kinds of people who write in
and
different genres.
yeah, Nikki Payne wrote a story that's a Caroline Bingley in the American West, and it is
Sounds wonderful.
horrific. It is terrific.
Okay, good.
Um, so it's exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, that'll be a lot of fun. So there's where my next books are. And I'm so grateful to all of you for coming and Sarah for asking all these beautiful questions. Thank you so much, hon. It's been
You
great
know, I
always.
always want to ask you questions with or without an audience. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you.
So,
Thank
folks,
you, everyone.
let's give Eloisa and Sarah a big virtual round of applause. For those watching live, please take the feedback survey when you exit the Zoom and look for a follow-up email from me tonight with a link to the recording, and I'll have information about Eloisa and Sarah's new books. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Have a great night,
Thank you,
Eloisa.
Robert.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank you,
Bye.
Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Bye. Good night.
Good night.